to do this webinar. I'm very pleased to do this webinar, not just for presenting some of the work that I've been doing last year, but also in exploring how that work applies to the field of digital technologies, which is certainly not my field of expertise. So what I'm hoping to do here is to introduce a couple of notions that I think might be relevant, exploring a bit how these notions are indeed probably relevant for the field of digital technologies. And during the discussion time, I'm really also hoping to get some responses that might help me further to explore that application of the notions. So let me share my presentation here. As you can see, the handout of the presentation is already available through the QR code at the final end of the presentation. You will again find the QR code and a short link. Good. As for the title, Opening the Black Box does not only refer to the notion of opacity or intransparency that, of course, in your field of digital technologies is much more common. But it also harks back a bit to philosopher and sociologist of science, Bruno Latour's notion of opening the black box of science, where he, in his work From Science in Action, argues that we really have to pay attention also to the process that lead up to the publications and other results of scientific work, to see to what extent, for instance, power dynamics play a certain role in shaping and guiding that process of scientific work. So it's that double notion that I'm applying here. Indeed, also hoping to get a discussion started on how does epistemic injustice and epistemic resistance may matter for the development, the implementation, and the use of digital technologies. Towards the end, or maybe in a discussion time, we can also explore how digital technologies actually might help the subjects of epistemic injustice to create a resistance, to present a resistance. That is not something that I will discuss more elaborately later. So for today, these are the four sections of the presentation. My aim is to keep that within 30 minutes, so we do have ample time for a conversation afterwards. First, I'm going to introduce, maybe for some, it's not really a first introduction, but then maybe a discussion of these notions of epistemic injustice. Then try, as I mentioned, to apply these notions to digital technologies. Then I'm going to talk about epistemic resistance, which is much less common than the notion of epistemic injustice. And in the article that I wrote with my colleague from Mexico, Hans Dieleman, we also introduced a differentiation between endogenous and exogenous epistemic resistance, which will be elaborated further down. And finally, as mentioned, I'm going to briefly ask to what extent digital technologies are different from the common knowledge production and dissemination processes that epistemic injustice is applied to. So to what extent are these less prone to these kind of pressures by epistemic subjects? The background for the article that we wrote, which is part of a special issue on philosophy of interdisciplinarity, is the notion of interdisciplinary integration, that inter and also transdisciplinary projects, or also projects in which extra academic stakeholders are involved, they do require a form of integration of the different perspectives in one or another way, such that it really creates a new and integrated, more comprehensive, more systemic insight that can help to obtain more fundamental knowledge or to solve an actual concrete, real world problem. But it's this notion of integration that does require from all components of this more comprehensive insight to adjust itself such that it fits, that it shares a language or shares modalities with each other in order to create this more comprehensive whole. And in epistemic injustice and epistemic resistance cases, it's this integration that is sometimes explicitly or implicitly resisted because the assumption behind that integration imperative is that this common language or common framework should be developed. Further down, I think this will be more elaborated. And the case studies that Hans Dieleman and I used in this article were two different forms of epistemic resistance, one by a community of autistic subjects who resisted more from within scientific projects in which they were invited to collaborate, critiquing certain elements of the project, whereas the other, the exogenous epistemic resistance described by Hans Dieleman involved a case in which indigenous communities in Latin America resisted to be involved in the sustainability science projects because the assumptions were such that it really excluded the kind of indigenous knowledge and worldview that they brought along. So epistemic injustice is a particular form of injustice. And when it was introduced in 2003 by Miranda Fricker, she defined it as a wrong that is done to someone specifically in their capacity as a knower. So, of course, we can do wrongs to persons in terms of their physical, their bodily existence as the owner of goods, of the bearer of rights, and in this case, it's really specifically targeting them as knowers. In a much more recent handbook of epistemic injustice, the editor has a somewhat broader definition where epistemic injustice concerns forms of unfair treatment that relate to issues of knowledge, understanding, and also participation in communicative practices. As you can see, the latter definition is really wider than the first one, and as we shall see, this resonates with the further elaboration of this notion of epistemic injustice as it has been done in the last few decades. So, what is epistemic injustice? Well, there in the initial formulation by Miranda Fricker, two forms, testimonial and hermeneutical injustice. Later, I think an important addition was made in terms of either contributory or participatory injustice, and as I will show in a moment, even more like the taxonomy is getting more and more elaborated. But the idea is that people are unable or disallowed to contribute to epistemic knowledge, to epistemic projects, to projects that somehow involve the use, the creation, or the dissemination of knowledge. And in the most simple case of testimonial injustice, a subject is devalued as a person, as a knowing person, so the credibility of that person is devalued due to prejudice or stereotype that is often common in the society, in the community that it involves. So, for instance, your testimony as, for instance, as a person of color is not taken seriously by the police because of the prejudices and the biases against persons of color generally. As more and more evidence shows, for instance, um, the indications of female patients are often taken less seriously by medical doctors. They get fewer pain medication, for instance, because their indications of having pain are not taken as seriously as in the case of male subjects. So the credibility of the testimony of that person is just assessed much lower than for, let's say, the majority or the dominant group in a particular epistemic context. Then there's a somewhat more complex form of epistemic injustice, which is hermeneutical injustice. Because this is not directly targeted to a particular subject or community, but it refers to a more systemic lack, a systemic issue of the wider context in which both minority and majority groups are suffering from. So this has to do with a gap in collective interpretive resources. And in her book, for instance, Miranda Fricker refers to the fact that before the Me Too movement and more recent developments, a notion of sexual harassment was not commonly known by all people, both like victims of sexual harassment and the perpetrators. And without that notion, often for individual victims, it was difficult to really get a sense of what is actually happening here. Is this really a strange situation, or should I just accept it? Ah, this is part of normal behavior. But by introducing this term of sexual harassment, they were able to label the particular experience as really a form of indeed aggression or transgression. Similarly, the notion of microaggression, for instance, helped communities to articulate the very slight and minor insults or accusations sometimes that they would receive, like, hey, you're actually speaking quite well Dutch, huh? What often like people from former colonies who were raised and educated in Dutch but would have a different accent are still getting hurt. So these microaggressions are recognized due to the fact that this notion is introduced. So the collective interpretive resources that we as a wider society have at our disposal allow minority subjects and also others to interpret or sometimes reinterpret events and experiences. And then there's the more obvious form of contributory or participatory injustice, in which cases people or groups are really like prevented from, isolated from processes of participating in knowledge construction and dissemination projects. I will not go further in detail here, but this is a more recent, let's say, kind of taxonomy of epistemic injustice, and where you can see also that there's forms of like systemic or collective injustices, including epistemicide, in which case a community, including its historical, sometimes indigenous knowledge, is completely like eradicated, sometimes due to a genocide or war, which again is not just a case of victimization of that community, but actually also for us as, let's say, a global community of knowers means that we are lacking a particular resource which might have been helpful in addressing collective problems. As mentioned, you can find the handout later, so then you can glance over the taxonomy more in detail. Now, if before applying it to digital technologies, being a philosopher myself, I felt somewhat similar to like Aristotle, who developed a kind of a taxonomy of living beings, etc., as a way to, so how can I apply these notions of epistemic injustice and later epistemic resistance? So I checked the literature and found several organizations or taxonomies or categorizations, and I think the one that I listed here may help us to find ways to apply these notions. So it ranges from the let's say the hardware, the infrastructure, but it of course also involves the internet, Wi-Fi, etc. And it goes all the way down to institutions like communities of practice, platforms, social media platforms at the bottom of it. So let's see how it works. And this is really kind of a work in progress. So it's certainly not a definitive statement on what is at stake here. So how would we find, or what shape would a testimonial injustice, this phenomenon of the credibility deficit, how would it look in the context of digital technologies? Well, I'm not, again, not going through all these five suggestions, but in the case of infrastructure, for instance, there are cases in which, like, rural communities, or let's say primitive societies, are not taken seriously as co-owners or co-creators of the infrastructure, because they might not be able to handle these complicated Western technologies. And something similar can return at the fifth item. So in terms of platforms, where sometimes the community moderation is such that people with very different different communities cannot really contribute. And so there are many cases in which, for instance, LGBTQ plus communities, when they try to articulate or express their specific experiences and the prejudices, etc., from which they suffer, that they are censored from certain or when, for instance, oral history is not taken seriously in certain Reddit communities, because it's not really scientific, science-based. In between, you will find different forms of testimonial injustice. What I find really interesting also in the literature is at the third level, when it is about models. That the predictive models, both like in your everyday use of your Google Maps or whatever, but also in medical systems, that there's a kind of a statistical or digital double of ourselves, which sometimes seems to trump the explicit testimony that we as an individual would give. So there's a prediction of a certain risk, a medical risk that you would have based upon, let's say, the data included in your quantified self, which might be hinting in a different direction than for your medical practitioner, for instance, your medical doctor, in a different direction from what you yourself as a patient are explicitly mentioning to your doctor. So is your testimony as an individual sometimes taken less seriously than the quantified self's predictions that might go in a different direction? So that's the testimonial injustice applied to digital technologies. In the case of hermeneutical injustice, as mentioned earlier, this is a somewhat more complex phenomenon, because it really refers to the wider environment in which all groups, including majority groups or those that are, let's say, at the buttons of the digital technologies, are all lacking these interpretive resources. For instance, when it is about co-designing or co-creating the infrastructure, for many people it's really difficult to understand, or maybe in some cases their language will not have the kind of notions and concepts that would explain how a digital infrastructure works or how it can be designed. So they cannot really offer their thoughts on it just because they lack the necessary conceptual and linguistic resources. Then, of course, as is well known in terms of data collections, and as you are much more aware of than I, the lack of data, like training data, really hampers all of us. And as is well known, the data collection, including like the harvesting of books, has a huge predominance of English-based data, whereas many languages are not at all included here. Certainly not when these languages don't have a written database to their disposal. Philosopher Claudia Ricci refers to kind of a double hermeneutic injustice here, because it's not just the fact that you cannot contribute or you don't have any hermeneutic control over how your identity or how the data of your community or your person are being used or included in models, for instance, but also many people don't have, again, don't have the hermeneutic resources to discuss this at all, to raise this as a problem, to articulate what is actually at stake here. They just experience it, but they don't know really how to formulate the problem as such. And then there's the somewhat more obvious forms in which participation or the ability to contribute is awarded or diminished for several groups and individuals. And as I mentioned below, I think what is really at stake here and that might be peculiar to digital technologies, is that in many of these technologies or platforms or models, there's a kind of a winner-takes-all environment. If you're late to the game, then it might be really difficult to substantially contribute to a particular platform or technology or model to be developed. So minorities are really at a back foot here, kept at a distance from which it's really difficult for them to recover in some sense. So I've highlighted three different forms of epistemic injustice, and what is really important to realize that often these different forms are also interdependent or interacting with each other, creating this, as Aymani and others refer to, this cycle of invisibility. If you're not able to contribute to certain knowledge bases, for instance, it also means that the hermeneutic resources that you might be able to offer are actually not taken into account and are thus also not available to others, which in turn then make it more difficult also for like other members of your community to contribute to these resources, because these resources like Wikipedia and Reddit are not like receptive to the kind of terms or concepts or maybe forms of contribution that you could offer to them. Fortunately, epistemic injustice does also solicit its own resistance, epistemic resistance. And in this table, in this slide, you can find a whole spectrum of epistemic friction and resistance. Epistemic resistance, as defined by Javier Medina, as using epistemic resources and abilities to undermine and change oppressive normative structures and the complacent cognitive affective functioning that sustains those structures. So it's using or playing with knowledge-based or knowledge-oriented actions, concepts, etc., in order to change the knowledge project or the knowledge context, or as you can find at the bottom of this table, completely withdrawing from a particular form of epistemic project or epistemic interactions. So it starts at the spectrum of epistemic resistance, starts from slight forms of friction or resistance, like refocusing attention, for instance, asking for particular texts, for instance, to be included in a knowledge base, for particular concepts to be included in a compendium of a particular knowledge resource. So that's really working within the current epistemic project and then adding or refocusing attention. Of course, recategorization is a very common phenomenon, or redefining, for instance, how do we define wealth such that it's only about GPT, or does it also include like the wealth of good education, a health, society with health institutions, etc. Does health only amount to physical health, or can we also include mental health in the definition of health? These forms of redefinitions are, of course, the bread and butter to what many of us in academia are doing. As mentioned in the beginning, in the article, we spelled out two different forms of epistemic resistance. One, endogenous, so autistic communities were in several cases like resisting internally against a particular projects because of the assumptions in the research project about, for instance, autism being a deficit, so someone lacking somewhat, instead of just being a form of neurodiversity, without like prioritizing the neurotypical or neural majority, but just including autism as one form of a whole range of neurodiversity. That's a redefinition that takes out the power difference that the original skewed definition of autism in terms of a deficit imposed upon that community. So as you can see, the critique, the resistance was associated with a particular plea, a plea for a much more neurodiverse approach, which didn't have this assessment, this prioritization of certain forms of neurotypicality above, for instance, autism. And in general, the argument was made for epistemic humility. Don't assume that the assumptions of your particular research project that they should be shared by others, but remain open for dissenting opinions and maybe willing to redefine the starting point of your project. A much stronger form of epistemic resistance was found in the case that Hans Dieleman described, where the communities, Latin America, Amazonian communities, withdrew from sustainability projects because they felt that their ontology, which, for instance, ascribes to living beings, to mountains and rivers, rights and spiritual dimensions, similar to what humans are ascribed to. These notions were not accepted, could not be included in the science project, in the sustainability science projects that they were invited to. And as a result, these communities developed an alternative vision of sustainability called Buen Vivir, showing how it has a much more holistic approach, and to what extent it really changes in principal dimensions from let's say, the Western, somewhat neo-colonial sustainability projects that they were invited to. So in the cases that we described and analyzed, we propose a couple of responses to these phenomena of epistemic injustice and resistance. And There are many other forms, but I think we structured them in two parts. One, really starting a dialogue, and then really an open and equitable dialogue about power dynamics. Again, think of the black box I mentioned at the beginning, in which Bruno Latour also describes how often in science projects, and even in the case of like physics and mathematics, power dynamics, hierarchy, reputation, etc., play such a role that the equal contribution to the project is undermined. So dialogue is a way to address these issues and to change the narrative, the shared narrative about the epistemic project. Another form, and taking it out of the merely conceptual and linguistic mode, is to engage in a joint imagination, developing scenarios, even like embodied experiences involving those for future possibilities in which these hierarchies and these domination structures are being discarded. So trying really from scratch to redescribe the challenge, the problem that is being addressed in the project. And then, as mentioned, this is my final slide. I'm here trying to explore, like, would the context of digital technologies, how are they open to these responses or in the form of dialogue and imagination? And then I see, but again, I'm not an expert in this field, but I see really some obstacles here. Obstacles, if you would compare them even to the larger international science or epistemic projects that we are used to consider. The global scope of these technologies has certain when it comes to models, to knowledge systems, to digital communities. It has a global scope. There are undefined stakeholder and also owners of these communities. You have to have an access to the digital technologies often to participate. So there's a kind of a catch-22 there. You cannot participate because, for instance, the hermeneutical injustice is such that you, as a community, as a minority, don't have the linguistic or interfaces even to contribute, and as such, you're also excluded from widening the community at stake. Then, of course, and I think the last year we've witnessed a lot of the impact that private and rich firms or even individuals have without any accountability. So it's really difficult to hold developments, to pause the developments and to enter underrepresented communities in the process if there's just a few people sitting at the bottom that have no accountability to any society or community at all. And I think what is also important, and that holds for transdisciplinary projects in which like citizens or patients or farmers or policymakers are involved, and for transdisciplinary projects in general, also the speed of the progress of the developments in epistemic projects, or in this case, in the development of digital technologies, is such that for communities or individuals, it is really difficult to keep up with that speed. The investment of time, irrespective of resources, the investment of time necessary to really contribute to have an impact on the development of these digital technologies is often, certainly for underrepresented and often like socioeconomically challenged communities, really difficult to bring to the table. So even from the temporal structure of these developments, it's very difficult to contribute. And as a result, and that's the closure of my presentation, I think it really implies that researchers and other contributors to the field of digital technologies do have really a moral obligation to even more comprehensively apply the notion of precautionary principle here. So really consider from the very beginning to how and where and when the project you're engaged in might harm underrepresented communities or had different traditions, underrepresented linguistic communities, etc. So how might it harm them not to be involved and not to be represented? And really bring a lot of effort to the table, had to engage in the communicative action in a Habermasian sense, to engage in dialogue and joint imagination in a timely fashion, such that the digital technologies that are developing are being co-designed and co-shaped by these communities. So I think that's where I'm going to stop my presentation in a moment. As you can see, the handout is available for your reference.
It was an excellent presentation. Thank you very much, Machiel, and thank you for your time. Just before continuing to Q&A, I'd like to let everybody know that I've posted a link in the chat.
Thank
We
you.
just collect some we do a very short survey just to gauge how we're doing with impact on our webinars. So if you could help out and do that, it takes less than 30 seconds probably. I'm going to stop recording right now. So please